Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Sam Knowles. Welcome to this latest end-of-season wrap-up of Data Malarkey, the podcast about using data smarter. We've now completed 9 seasons of the pod, and this greatest hits episode marks the 66th that we agents of insight have shared with the world since Data Malarkey was born in March 2023. That puts us almost 2/3 the way to a century. We started the season with a timely and important conversation with Kerry Beaver, Chief Executive of the market research giants Ipsos. I first met Kerry at the Market Research Society's July 2025 Data-Driven Insights Conference. For as well as running Ipsos in the UK and Ireland, Kerry is also a leading light at the MRS and has put a lot of time and energy into the Society's Campaign for Better Data, which launched in May 2025. The campaign is the first coordinated response from the UK research and analytics industry to the existential threat it faces from unfettered and unchanneled use of artificial intelligence. Here, Kerry outlines the role of AI in the industry and the MRS's campaign. She also details her hugely memorable concept of ultra-processed data in the age of AI.
You mentioned the initialism, or maybe it's an acronym, artificial intelligence, and it is obviously radically changing the research and analytics business, from automating data collection, real-time sentiment analysis, iterative predictive analytics, synthetic personae. I could kind of go on. Is the rapid evolution in AI in research one of the main motives, one of the driving forces behind the campaign?
Absolutely. So as you've highlighted, it's transforming the industry in lots of different ways. And as I said, it's a mix of the opportunity to drive more efficiencies and get deeper insights, and in particular, to be able to create data for some of those really hard to reach groups based on smaller populations. Already at Ipsos, we're harnessing AI to be able to do a huge amount, which involves improving the quality of survey translations, analysing data sets, and also helping us to identify emerging trends for huge swathes of data. But with all of those great opportunities, as I said, it does create potential for risk as well. So perhaps, if you're utilising AI substantively, but you're not doing it well, there are risks around reputation, around credibility, and ultimately trust and credibility are some of the real lifeblood elements of our industry. So we've seen over the last few years rises in sophisticated survey fraud. Now, survey fraud isn't new. It's something that our industry's been very good at managing over long periods of time. But now there's new generative AI capabilities which offer new ways to infiltrate survey collection techniques and ultimately more prevalence of fraud. So you've also got you mentioned synthetic as well. And of course, synthetic data needs to be really grounded in high quality, real data in a good period of time, close to the proximity at which you're going to be making a decision on that data. So there are lots of opportunities where AI is great, but also where you need to be very careful in how you utilize it. So the campaign should now provide a really useful framework for responsible and ethical AI use in research.
Perfect. Now, at the MRS conference in July, you talked about, I absolutely love this. And you talked about the challenges of ultra-processed data. And as a gym bunny myself, and a regular runny myself, and a kind of devourer of Chris Van Tulleken's work and so on and so forth, I just thought, and I wasn't alone, I could see the pennies dropping in the eyes of the audience. We latched onto this brilliant analogy with ultra-processed food. Can you explain, I know you've been hinting at it already, but what you mean by ultra-processed data and the genuine threats it poses to our industry?
Yeah, it was on the way to the MRS conference, and I was thinking about what I was going to say when I was speaking. And I obviously, given my gin bunny status as well, which is only a new thing in the last 2 years, and I really
Same here.
Yes, I've been reformed, but it did make me reflect a little bit on some of the potential dangers of data that has been through lots and lots of algorithmic processing, and where the origins and the integrity of that data largely become obscured to the users. And if you think about the analogy of the ultra-processed food, which is much well known in our society now, people talk about that as a very well-known acronym, never mind full stated word, and it's convenient, it's cheap, it's full of artificial additives, lacks real nutritional value. And similarly, when you think about the term ultra-processed data, yes, it could be quick and easy to generate, often through automated processes and AI, but it could lack the essential sort of nutrients of quality research. And by that, I mean transparency, representativeness, and a clear link back to real human experience. And this is why this campaign for better data is absolutely vital. It's about sort of championing the whole food equivalent in our industry. So data that's really fresh, it's well sourced, it's minimally processed, and in a way where it's transparent and understandable where the source of that data has come from.
Perfect. Well, listen, congratulations for coining such a brilliant neologism.
I'm sure if I looked hard enough, I bet you I could find it somewhere else. Anyway, good. I'm glad that it resonated, but also that it helped cut through, because often when you think about the use of AI and survey research techniques, you immediately get bogged down in very technocratic language, and you're talking about, synthetic data, you're talking about algorithms, and people get lost. But ultimately, what we're talking about is data where you really understand the source of that data and the treatment that it's been through, so that you can understand what you're looking at and what you're making decisions on the basis of.
AI was also very definitely on the menu in the last episode of Season 9, when I had the very great pleasure of talking to Angus Fletcher, Director of Story Science at Ohio State University, where he runs Project Narrative. Angus is the author of the 2025 bestseller Primal Intelligence, in which he maps out his model of thinking, narrative cognition. The model champions the interlocking roles of imagination, intuition, emotion, and common sense, and the primacy of storytelling and story thinking, making plans for short, in making sense of the changing world around us. First off, Angus explains narrative cognition.
Narrative cognition, the central concept underpinning primal intelligence, and I guess your worldview, the role played by intuition, imagination, emotion, and common sense. Can you put a bit more flesh on the bones of narrative cognition for us?
Yeah, so narrative cognition, another word for that would be story thinking. So as opposed to storytelling, it's how your brain is essentially inventing new stories. And as I've already talked about, I think a huge part of human intelligence is the ability to invent new stories. If you can invent a new story, you can be an entrepreneur, you can be an innovator. You can also, of course, be a scientist, because you can imagine, how is it that the world is working differently than I've been told? And of course, you can also be a great dramatist, a great playwright, all these kinds of things. And so I want to understand, how is it that the brain does this? How does it invent new stories? Where is this coming from? And so I've done a lot of research on this, but the simplest way that to communicate it to people, as I do in the book, is to say, well, basically the way that the brain uses stories is by using these kinds of 4 basic powers. And these powers, I encourage people to think of them as heuristic. There's not literally regions of the brain that do this, but they sort of make it simpler to understand the deep process. And so the first thing with a story is you need to identify an opportunity for a story. Where is there something new? Every good writer, every investigative reporter, every novelist is always looking around for something interesting that sparks a story, that sparks a narrative. And that power is intuition. So the kind of most basic power of your brain in terms of narrative cognition is intuition. Children have a lot of this power. Adults have very little of this power. And that's because children are always fascinated by what's unique, what's special, what's extraordinary about something, whereas adults are conditioned into having this efficiency or productivity psychology, where they just want to move as quickly as possible. And so they're usually just dismissing things that they don't understand and saying, oh, that's a waste of my time, regress that to the mean. Just like a computer skips over exceptions or judges them as aberrant, adults are bad at intuition. And so that power, that kind of power that children have of intuition to spot what is unusual and value it, to spot anomalies and lean into them, that's the first part of narrative cognition. The second part, which is imagination, is the ability to take those exceptions to rules and turn them into new stories, turn them into new sequences of action. So once you've seen something that surprises you, to imagine to yourself, where could it go? Where would this kind of unusual thing carry me? And this is the basis, I think, of most effective stories. Most effective stories start with an anomaly, which is known as a hero. The hero is the exception to the rules of their world. And what does the hero do? The hero doubles down on what's unique about themselves. And by doing so, you start to have this plot. And that plot is generated through conflict between the hero and their world, which is to say conflict between the conventional and the unconventional. And so that's the second power, imagination. So when you put together intuition and imagination, what you have is a brain that's able to come up with all these new stories, which is to say all these new plans, all these new different ways that I could act. And when you talk to very creative people, they always have lots of ideas for new businesses. They have lots of ideas for new things they could do with their day. They're always kind of constantly coming up with all these fascinating ideas about what tomorrow could look like. And then, of course, immediately they get totally overwhelmed because they have all these ideas. And which ones do I do? And so you have to then start to decide which of these ideas that you do. And if you were a computer, what you would do is you would apply probability or some other metric. But the way that the human brain does it is it uses these two powers, emotion and common sense. And what common sense does is it matches your plan to your environment. And just very simply, what that means is that if you're in a highly new environment, you need a very new plan. And so in very fast-changing environments, there's a premium on creativity and innovation. But in an environment that's fairly predictable or stable, there's very little benefit to that. And so you can kind of go with something that's less innovative. In fact, maybe a very boring plan that you've used a lot before. And so common sense helps you select which plan will kind of work. And what emotion does is emotion helps you select which plan will work for you. Because each of us has our own life story. And so we're not just trying to, create these stories out in the world. We're trying to create these stories out in the world in a way that is organic to our own narrative. And your emotions help you do that. There are just certain stories that will feel wrong to you, will feel inauthentic to you, will cause you various forms of kind of negative emotion or so on and so forth. And so being able to understand your own emotions helps you pick the best story that connects with where yourself wants to go. So that's primal intelligence, intuition, imagination, common sense, and emotion. And basically all just comes down to making new plans and then picking the right plan for you in the moment.
Turns out, narrative cognition is particularly effective in situations characterized by little or patchy data, domains where AI really sucks. Angus explains why.
Now, you've become known for your recent proof that computer AI lacks the physical hardware to be able to replicate human creativity. I think that's fair to say that? Yeah, you've said even a sentient, self-aware, and infinitely powerful computer could never innovate or plan to take over the world. If you can fit that into a podcast-sized nutshell, could you tell us why?
Sure. So computers think in equations because that's how logic works. And the human brain thinks in actions. And actions and equations are just totally different physical mechanisms. We know this because whenever logicians, so the whole study of equations and all of computation comes to us from symbolic logic. It's a field that originates with Aristotle over 2,000 years ago. And when logicians try and analyze actions, they always end up immediately with this paradox. And the paradox runs something like this. You've got an action. Well, what is an action? An action is a cause and it's an effect. In other words, it's something that's initiating the action and then the action itself carrying on. Okay, so you've got a cause and an effect. Okay, so logically, the cause and the effect have to take place at the same period of time. Otherwise, they couldn't interact. But also logically, they can't be taking place at the same time because if they were taking place at the same time, they would be the same thing, and one of them, has to precede the other or follow the other. So you start to get into all these just enormous logical puzzles once you start to try and analyze action from the perspective of equations. And what that starts to reveal over time is that logic is a wonderful tool for analyzing certain situations, but it is not the same as reality. Reality is made up of actions. Logic is a tool of taking some of what happens in life and turning it into math equations, which can be useful in certain moments. And so computers, because they're made up entirely of logic gates, can only think in equations. They can't think in actions. As a result, if you say to a computer, Sam runs, the computer will have to take Sam runs and turn that into Sam is running, which you will notice equates Sam with running. And so what that means is that Sam is no longer causing the running. Sam just is the running. And that means that the running just exists eternally, and has no origin. And you see where this starts to happen. And this is why large language models hallucinate, are confused. That's why they're incapable of having world models. All these problems that people have noticed with AI. It's because logic just doesn't understand the world of action. It doesn't understand causation. It only thinks in correlation. And so, the more that your listeners want to go down this rabbit hole, the more that they'll see this to be the case. But the proof of it ultimately is that these LLMs, these large language models, are significantly less intelligent than human children, even though they possess significantly more data. And we're going to see more and more of this divergence. And what that's really telling you is that logic is a really powerful tool for doing certain things, but it is not the equivalent of human intelligence. And if we want to make humans smarter, we actually probably need to spend less time on computers and more time nurturing the parts of our intelligence that are distinct.
Kerry Watkins runs the Brighton-based agency Social for Good, which helps charities and purpose-led businesses make smarter use of social media. In a world too often dominated by the darker side of social, I was intrigued first to discover how Kari spends her time.
How do I spend my time? I spend my time balancing my life online with offline, I would say, because having worked in social for 15 years now, that was a stark contrast to working in the hospitality sector, where you're just very much there in person. There is very little time spent on social. And so that was a big change. So I think now, 15 years later, my time is spent being productive and efficient with the time that I spend online, which is I do a 4-day week. So that's 4 days, kind of 8 hours a day minimum. And I think it would be very easy for me to spend a lot more time, just I'm exhausted from the day. So I'm going to watch Netflix or scroll social on my phone. So my time is spent doing the things that I think keep me well balanced, walking the dog, playing chess, sewing, things that help my kind of well-being, my focus, doing something that's kind of more, getting into your body and kind of out of your mind. But I don't have enough people to play chess with. The family are getting a bit bored. So
I hope that doesn't mean you'll be resorting to online and digital chess.
Oh no, I have a chess app, but it's really not as rewarding as the real thing. So maybe I need to find a chess club.
Very good. I've recently, with a friend, set up a club in Lewis, just along the road from you, centered around the ancient Oriental Chinese-Japanese game of Go. And yes, you can play online and the rest of it, but just that immersion in the board with the black and white pieces, I think, is a brilliant way of taking one out of digital life. So bringing balance, I think, is going to be a drumbeat of this conversation.
I was particularly interested to find out how Kerry squares the circle of running a media agency while at the same time not becoming too ensnared in the murkier groves of social platforms, not least because of the side hustle she's currently expanding and exploding, 24/6. Twice in the past couple of years, Kerry has been on digital detox boot camps run by another former Data Malarkey podcast alumna, Anastasia Dedyukina, the founder of the Consciously Digital Institute. Here, Kerry explains her own journey and the origins of her new 24/6 movement, designed to bring balance to the force and detail the best strategies to avoid being always on.
I think it was during COVID I started studying digital well-being. That was out of a desire to educate myself as a parent more than anything about digital behavior, the relationships that we as humans and as young people, my daughter was approaching teenage years back then, the relationship we have with tech, how does that impact our mental health, our behavior, physical health? And I just felt it's this, like I said earlier, I was worried about the impact of social, but didn't really have the knowledge to arm myself to know what to do about that. So I focused on doing good stuff through my work. But when I started studying digital well-being, while a whole world of knowledge was then available to me, and my mind was blown. And again, probably a good year or two, I didn't really know what to do with it. But I learned so much about our hormones in our brain, neuroscience, behavior change, willpower, multitasking, every element of life that's impacted by not just our smartphones, but the way that we live and work today. And I hadn't thought that this would ever be a business. It was literally just to try and make myself understand more so I could think about how do I guide my daughter into the world of social and digital in a way that she comes out as unscathed as possible. There's some hard conversations, but I couldn't just share all of this with her at once because, she was, I think, like 13 or 14. And, you can't explain about neuroplasticity and when your prefrontal cortex is fully developed. And that's why you can't use that app for more than 10 minutes a day and so on. So I kind of had enough information to try and guide her, but then I still felt a bit, just there was some kind of energy around this. I thought I want to do something, but I don't know what it is. So I decided to go on a digital detox and see if I could do it, see how it felt. I thought the thought of it actually really scared me. As somebody that loves work, I love technology. I think it's great. I'm certainly not advocating for, living off grid and foraging for berries. But yeah, I felt really nervous about doing a detox. So I thought, well, because I feel so nervous about it, I should do it. I should challenge myself. So I went to Catalonia with Anastasia, who you know from Consciously Digital Institute. And it was such a profound experience. It was challenging. It was emotional. You go through stages of being extremely bored, of being fidgety, of feeling lonely. But suddenly your brain is actually starting to process your thoughts in a different way, to process your emotions, because you can't pick up your phone when you're just like, okay, I feel I've got nothing to do, or I feel a bit lonely and I haven't seen my family, so I'm just going to pick up my phone. You actually had to sit with that uncomfortableness. And that's something I hadn't done since the first iPhone came out. And I left that experience with what I could only describe as a sparkly brain. I remember being on the bus back to Barcelona airport, buzzing with ideas. And that's where 24/6 started. I started to think about it. It wasn't called that then, but it's like, I need to do something with this. I don't know if it's with young people. I don't know if it's with adults like me who grew up without a smartphone. Perhaps that's more a relatable audience to me, but I knew I wanted to do something. My brain felt like spring clean, sparkly, full of energy, full of ideas. And that lasted for a little while, but inevitably your old habits kind of come back again. I wasn't reading as many books. I took my crocheting and Sudoku book with me to Catalonia. Suddenly I wasn't doing any of that. And I realized it's really hard to change your habits and behavior. I went on a second detox which is a year ago now, to Sardinia, which was a different experience. There were a lot more activities planned in the day. It was a lot more fun. So you weren't left with as much alone time to feel uncomfortable, but it still gave a lot of benefits. And when I got back from that, I think it was around then, Brighton Chamber asked me to do a workshop around the summit. The theme of the summit was 24/7, always on. And so I thought, well, what can I call my workshop? So I came up with 24/6, and it just seemed like a good name, which has stuck, how to avoid being always on. And we shared some research in that workshop about the impact of smartphones and technology on our sleep, our relationships, our physical health, our well-being. We did some little activities. And I didn't know what would come from that workshop, but it was nice to be able to channel that energy into doing something. And I love working with people and actually being with people in real life. Perhaps that stems back to the hospitality days. But the feedback I got after that workshop was phenomenal. And it was really clear to me, people need this. People don't really know what to do to address their own things that are annoying about their smartphones. And the conversation we had in the room involved, people being, my partner does this, or my kids do this, and suddenly realized everybody has an opinion on this, and most people are just not happy with the way that they use technology. So that's really where it came from. And so I kind of working with a brilliant designer, created a brand. I've got a website live, but that's kind of as far as I've got. I have learned over the years that not to plan everything to the finest detail, but I much prefer to put something out there, and then collaborations. I've already had invitations for collaborations on where to take this forward, who to work with, what does that look like. So I think over the next 12 months, it's going to find the form that it needs. But at the moment, it's very simple. I can come and run a workshop around it to kind of help teams in the workplace think about how they are, use their time better to be more productive, which we've learned a lot about by doing the 4-day week, of course, at Social for Good. Or I'd really love to do some kind of community days with groups of people who just want to leave their smartphone at home, or maybe I look after it because I have to find out where we are. And we get back into nature and we just kind of explore some of the themes that I've learnt, just to give them a little bit more awareness. And maybe that's enough to spark something to make their lives at home or work a little bit better. But I'm excited to see where it will go.
A sparkly brain. What a truly brilliant and memorable phrase. Stephen Waddington has been a big thinker and leading player in the public relations industry for the past 20 years and more. He's really unusual as a PR man, and I can say this having lurked in the industry for a quarter of a century myself, even if I now call myself a reformed PR man. For Stephen is very much data-driven and evidence-based when it comes to planning, running, and crucially evaluating the real-world impact of public relations strategies. Here, Stephen outlines his unconventional journey into the world of communication, from his original training as an engineer, which, he argues, gives you a respect for a repeatable scientific process.
I'm a data-driven, academically curious fellow myself, and I'm always really interested to find those qualities in someone else. Your mentioning of engineering is really, really interesting, and I think you'd agree with me that it's fair to say that data-driven academic rigor is not necessarily something that's found in abundance in the PR industry. I've just been reading a new book on marketing effectiveness by a guy called Soren Petilanet, who's a former guest on this podcast. Indeed, he was the head of marketing effectiveness at Mars. He's now at Pepsi, and he trained as a telecoms engineer in 1990s Romania, and he brings that rigor. Tell us. The data and academic part, they ring your bell because of that engineering background?
I've been thinking about this recently, and trying to retrofit where this comes from, because you're right, there is you're right. There is, through my work, this drive for both self-improvement, but to improve the industry, and to do that through data. I think an engineering background gives you a respect for repeatable scientific process, and those are sorely lacking within the majority of corporate communication and public relations practice. But it also gives you a respect for knowledge, and knowledge that, has been laid down before through the generations, and certainly we lack the academic community and public relations, corporate communications, and practice they are completely two different communities. The people look different. They move in different places. They read different things. They don't occupy the same spaces, which is, it's a huge shortfall in practice. And I haven't experienced it as being extreme in any other areas, although undoubtedly, it may be. I think, we lack the rigor for all these reasons when we compare ourselves with law, with medicine, with engineering. Indeed, in engineering, I did an electronic engineering degree, and you're taught the absolute respect for repeatability and proof and validation, ultimately through science. And if you don't respect those things, the outcomes are absolutely catastrophic. Now, in public relations, we're arguably dealing with a sphere that's of equal importance, to engineering. We're dealing with the public sphere, we're dealing with conversation, we're dealing with issues of reputation and trust, yet we don't have this respect for knowledge in the same way. And I'm not sure why, because, data and academic standards provide credibility, they provide structure, they provide a foundation and a way of building on knowledge, and ultimately proof of value.
Very good, very good. No, I agree. It is perplexing, but there are voices. I mean, we've recently welcomed, I know you know him well, Daryl Sperry from Hard Numbers, the podcast. There are voices. I do sense that things are. I'm not active in the industry, but I think sense that things are changing in certain corners, and that it'll be a process of evolution. That those that take data and evidence and, as you say, repeatable scientific processes more seriously are going to be those who will thrive and survive.
Well, hello there. It's your host, Sam here. Now, I won't keep you for long. If you've been inspired by what you've been listening to today, and you'd like to find out what type of data storyteller you are, why not go to our data storytelling scorecard? Just follow the link to data-storytelling.scoreapp.com. That's score app with 2 P's. Answer 12 simple questions, and you'll instantly be served with a scorecard that tells you exactly what type of data storyteller you are. Now, back to the action and our brilliant guest. Data-driven rigour was a drumbeat running through my conversation with Stephen. Next, we talk about cheeseburgers and the need for communications and the profession of communications to adopt a McDonaldization approach. He also outlines the best way to bring together the stories and statistics for greater narrative impact. I want to talk about cheeseburgers.
Let's do it.
I think the McDonald's cheeseburger is important to you. Maybe not just as a nutrition source, but tell us about how you think the PR industry could benefit from McDonaldization.
So McDonald's is one of the most studied organizations in business schools. Countless papers have been written on it, everything from aspects of its organizational structure to its business model to systemization of the techniques. And I actually studied the repeatability of it, and I gave a presentation at Leeds Business School. We have a conference at the start of every year where people go and share their results, but and they were looking for interesting anecdotes. So I did this presentation on the McDonald's cheeseburger, and I set it up through data collection by going to a McDonald's in Newcastle, one in two in London, and going through the experience of buying a cheeseburger, and of course it was the same price, it looked the same, tasted the same, and there's absolute consistency, which is part of the McDonald's industrialization process. And I just tell the story of that that consistency and repeatability enables them to deliver the product at an affordable price point. We like that rigor in public relations. It's the same with the engineering metaphor at the top of the discussion. We do not have respect for that repeatability, for that rigor. And ultimately, it's one of the reasons our credibility suffers.
I hear you. I absolutely hear you, and I very much enjoy the pictures of the munched out cheeseburgers that feature in the presentation.
It worked really well. It worked really well. But again, we had a really good discussion because one of the points I made was in the science of corporate communications and public relations, there is a complete over-reliance on the use of survey instruments as data gathering, and that leads to issue. I mean, it's a beautiful allegory about about the need for critical thinking and critical approaches. Which is one of the things that's certainly come through this process.
Now, in your experience and opinion, you've talked about the Brew report, but in your experience and opinion, what's the best way for comms practitioners and others to combine narrative and numbers and stories and statistics for optimal impact in communications?
So I think numbers and data give you credibility. They give you a foundation for a story. But then the story brings those numbers to life to and engages people at a very human level. Let's not think, we're not going to convince anyone of an argument by sharing an Excel spreadsheet. But if we tell a story about that spreadsheet, then maybe we will. And the pints and profits, the example. There's some very hard data in there that tells the story of, pub closures in the UK and what that means for the fabric of society. The pub is one of the last community hubs, often within a village. The post offices are gone. And so, when you lose that, what's left within the community? COVID, we had, data on infection rates, and famously that crisis was told through charts on national television, but actually it was, the frontline stories of the impact on hospitals that really broke it through. So I think you need balance. You absolutely need data as the foundation of a story, but then a story is how you capture and create emotional resonance and ultimately change.
Susan Etlinger is an AI pathfinder who gave a memorable and still hugely relevant TED Talk at the TED at IBM conference in 2014, titled, "What Should We Do with All This Big Data?" More than a decade on from that far-sighted talk, I spoke to Susan shortly before she left a super senior role at Microsoft Azure AI. First off, she addresses the role of data in meaning-making, picking up on one of her most memorable lines from that 2014 talk, and the potential for AI tools, large language models, and many others, and how they are trained by big data sets.
Yeah, I mean, in the talk, I actually did say data doesn't create meaning, we do. I don't know whether that predates or postdates Nate Silver. So I will just say that we were certainly on the same wavelength when it comes to constructing meaning out of data. But we're not alone in this. I mean, we've been making meaning from data since the beginning of time, since early mathematics, and we've always been trying to understand the world using data, whether or not that data comes in digital form. And so this isn't new. I don't think of that as an insight. I think of it as kind of a reminder, really, more than anything else.
You say that we make meaning out of different types of data by applying context to these different types of data: images, text, video, and audio. I'm interested particularly in large language models. And a recent guest on the podcast, Chris Summerfield, the Oxford Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience, talked a lot about the very real similarities between the neural networks that we're creating and those that sit between our ears, and also the very real differences that we take in information in all sorts of different ways. Do you think that the fact that many of clearly the large language models make use of text and text alone, guessing the next token in the chain, do you think that's likely to limit their potential, or do you think that's a mischaracterization?
Well, far be it from me to contradict an Oxford professor, so I'm not going to do that. But I will say that there are many different types of models. And those so there are language models. There are language models that have a relative, let's say, ability to analyze visual input. And then there are models that have nothing to do with language whatsoever. So it's kind of a complex answer. I do think that we also have to think about what is training those models and where that data come from. Right. And so if that data come from the internet, then we're talking about a relatively prescribed number of languages. And of course, we have thousands of languages in the world. We have places in the world that do not have the same level of digital access that we do here in the Western world, or at least in the global North. And so by virtue of the fact that the data training the underlying models is constrained, that will constrain the output as well. Now, that said, there's a tremendous amount of innovation in model development going on. And there are many efforts underway at universities and elsewhere, and NGOs, to try to include more languages. And there's some really interesting work going on in South Africa. There's interesting work going on really all around the world to try to include more languages and include more perspectives. Because when you think about the fundamental inputs of large models, they're coming from the internet, right? They're coming from Reddit. They're coming from all of the sort of published information that is out there and available on the internet. And that doesn't necessarily represent the full reality. Now, over time, I do think it will improve. But, by virtue of the fact that we're still 3 years into the generative AI, let's say, revolution or whatever you want to call it, inflection point, there's still plenty more to do.
As regular listeners and viewers will know, I'm a huge fan of the Socratic paradox. The 5th century BC philosopher Socrates is said to have said many times when seeking to understand the essential nature of things, of truth, beauty, and so on, "All that I know is that I know nothing." Here, Susan addresses the essential role of humility in working with data and the technologies we're currently developing. She goes on to argue that former President of the US, Ronald Reagan, was misquoted or perhaps misunderstood when he infamously said, "Facts are stupid things."
I think that humility is incredibly important at the time that we're in, right? And the humility to recognize that we have this intensely powerful set of technologies that can describe and affect us in ways that we haven't thought about, and in ways that we do need to think about. And if you just go back to an analog, right? Here's an analog. One of them is the car, the automobile. There are lots of ways in which you can think about the automobile and the trajectory of the automobile, and sort of recognize what moment we're in and maybe what kinds of questions we should be asking. So, in the early days of the automobile, what happens if a bunch of people get in front of a whiteboard, or at that point, I suppose, a chalkboard, and think about what are all the things that could happen that would not be, productive, that would not be good for society, right? When are accidents, traffic congestion, air pollution, blah, 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 blah. I think it took 70 years to put seatbelts in cars, right? We can do better than that. Like 70 years ago was Alan Turing asking if machines could think. So 70 plus, right? So we have this opportunity. On the other hand, and so then there were efficiencies, right? So we have cars, then we have roadways. We have roadways, then we have faster transportation, and then we get refrigeration, and we have refrigerated trucks, and we can bring fresh food to people. And then things can happen, for example, that are not just about efficiency. And we are in the efficiency moment right now. That is really what everybody's thinking about. Let's take cost out of the system. Let's just, let's get squeeze as much productivity as we can. On the other hand, I think you just came back from New England, right? You drove from place to place. You had what might be called a road trip. Back at the turn of the 20th century, did people think about automobiles and road trips and just the sheer pleasure of being in a car with people that you love and playing games and listening to music? I mean, that's a beautiful thing too. So I guess what I'm arguing for, to the point of nausea probably, is why don't we think about some of the changes that we've seen in technology in our lifetimes and before our lifetimes? And why don't we learn from those? And by the way, there's an entire, there's an entire field of study, around technology and social impact that can help us better understand and think through the kinds of questions we should be asking. And so fundamentally, I think we should come to this with a combination of humility that we don't know everything, of question answering, and then also a sense of purpose around the fact that this technology, as powerful as it is in some ways a gift and in some ways a weapon. And, Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, famously wrote a book called Tools and Weapons. And, I subscribe to that idea that it is a tool, it is a weapon, and we need to be really intentional about the way we think about it.
Very good. Now, listen, in your talk, you talk about former US President and former governor of your state, Ronald Reagan, attracting unfair ridicule for describing facts as stupid things. He was misquoting John Allen's description of them as stubborn. But you argued that Reagan may, in fact, with his malapropism, have dispensed some accidental wisdom. Can you explain why?
Yeah, I mean, at the time, I said it in kind of sort of a whimsical example. It was sort of a whimsical anecdote, right? Because what I meant was that facts can be a little bit stupid in that they like data, have no agency. And of course, we're living in a world now where even the sheer existence of facts is sometimes disputed. And that is something that I hadn't anticipated 10 years ago. Maybe I had a glimmer, but certainly not to the point where it is today. And so what I meant was that facts can't argue for themselves. Facts can't defend themselves against being misconstrued. And that, I think, it was troubling to me at the time. It's more troubling to me now.
At the May 2025 Datacomms conference, it was my pleasure to record a first live episode of the podcast when I spoke to VW's Nick Radcliffe. I also heard several future Data Malarkey guests speak on stage for the first time, including Stephen Waddington, who we've already heard from, and Season 8's Daryl Sperry. This golden group also numbered Angela Balakrishnan, Executive Director of Strategic Communications and Public Affairs at the ICO, the UK Information Commissioner's Office. I started off by asking Angela if she believed that we'd lost control of data in the public sphere, and whether the general public actually care enough about their own data, which they tend to shed like digital dandruff.
I don't think we've lost control. I think it's just realising that technology and digitization is such a massive part of the world that we live in these days. And so that does come with an enormous amount of personal information that is shared, that is traded each day to go about our daily business. If you think about, 50 years ago, you left your house, you got on a bus, probably paid for that bus fare by cash, you didn't have a phone, you went and you placed your coffee order at a counter. You could go about your daily life without really needing to share your information through online or digital services. That's very different these days. You wake up in the morning, you might open your phone with facial recognition, you'll leave your house, you'll use Google Maps, your mobile phone will be pinging its way to a mobile phone mast, you might be scrolling social media, you'll tap in and out of a bus or the tube. All these things require us to share our information. And so in our digital world, we are shedding a trail of data as we go about the things that we need to do or we want to do to enjoy our lives. And that's fine. We want to make sure that the systems and the technology around us is set up in a way that people can do that confidently and with trust that their data is being safeguarded. And that's why we're here, to make sure that happens. And I think while the technology has developed, the core principles of data protection hasn't really changed. We still expect fairness and transparency. We still expect accuracy about how that information is being used and the proportionality. And most of all, we expect accountability. And so the way the ICO kind of focuses its work is making sure that the onus is on organisations who we are entrusting with our information are safeguarding it. And that's where we focus our efforts. Because if you think about it, often there is a bit of a power asymmetry there. If you're someone who needs to access a service, you might not have a choice but to give your information over. And so there is that power imbalance between the organisation and the individual. At the same time, though, as well as making sure organisations do it right, we do want to empower people. We want people to make sure that they are understanding their rights and that they have the opportunity to engage with them so that they can make informed decisions. So I think it's about choice rather than control. It's about giving people the tools and information so that they can feel like they are knowingly going in or confidently going into situations where they need to use or share their personal information.
Now, as you said, we all shed a trail of data in our mediated online lives. And I guess if we've been looking, it's been clear from the very early days of the digital revolution that if online services like social media are provided free, then we're the product. Our data will be traded by to advertisers, by platform owners. Do you think people care enough about protecting their data in the UK, around the world? And do we only tend to care if we're caught up in some kind of scam?
I mean, Sam, let's face it, no one goes around every day thinking about their personal information, especially as I've described, with the ways that we're sharing it all the time. We're doing it most of the time completely unconsciously. And to an extent, so we should. We need to have that trust in place that these systems are working to help us and to protect us at the same time. Of course, when something goes wrong, these issues can come to the fore. So, whether that's a data breach or thinking about something like those nuisance or what we've described as predatory marketing calls, where people's data has been used to target them with those annoying marketing calls that often end up scamming someone out of money. When those things happen, you do think about this a lot more, in the same way when other bad things happen in our life, it can kind of make us more conscious of some of the issues that we don't always focus on. We've done a bit of research as the ICO looking at public attitudes on information rights, and it's quite interesting because about half of adults that we surveyed said that, as I think you said, have had personal information lost or stolen, and about 7% of those have experienced negative impacts as a result of that. And what was surprising actually was 3/4 of people say that they've exercised at least one information right. So I think there is good kind of knowledge engagement with our rights. If you drill down into that a bit more, the knowledge about specific aspects of rights varies, but we are seeing a steady increase over the last few years and an increase in awareness of who the ICO are and the role that we play. So that's the positive. And then when you look at sort of specific behaviours, like are we seeing people change, for example, their privacy settings online or on social media platforms? I think we've seen about 50% of people that we surveyed have done that, which I think is a pretty solid result. And about half again said they wanted more control over the information that is being shared. And you do really see that with online platforms and social media. I think about 80% of people said that they want these platforms to be more transparent about how they're using people's information, and to help people exercise those controls a bit easier. And what I think is really interesting of late is you have seen some of those big tech companies communicate about their privacy settings, whether that's through adverts on TV or on online platforms. I've certainly seen quite a few scrolling on social media. And the fact that they're choosing to communicate about this indicates that their customers feel it's important, and so they're responding to that. So I think people care. Whether they care, as they go about their daily lives, probably not. But if you were to drill them on it, there is a level of knowledge and a level of engagement with our rights in this space.
Angela went on to tell me about the ICO's Ripple Effect campaign, which has the strapline, "It was only an admin error."
Essentially, data is about people. When we're looking at those hard numbers, they have people's stories, people's real lives behind them. And keeping that front and centre can, I think, really shift the way you communicate and develop these types of campaigns. What I loved about the Ripple Effect was it was a campaign that was absolutely grounded in solid data, and the way that we went about gathering that data. We used a trauma-informed approach to help us understand the experiences of the people that we want to help. So we'd identified this trend where people in often vulnerable situations. So we looked at people living with HIV and domestic abuse survivors were experiencing kind of higher than normal trend of data breaches, often by public authorities or organisations who were entrusted to be the ones keeping them safe or looking after them. And so to understand the experiences and the impacts of these data breaches, we had to do the research. We didn't want to make any assumptions, but how we did that research was a very sort of empathetic, people-focused way, using a trauma-informed approach for the in-depth interviews and the focus groups and the surveys, and working with partners who, had more of the connections with the audiences that we wanted to reach. We don't actually have those relationships as the data protection regulator, but we worked with charities like the Terence Higgins Trust and with Women's Aid. And then, there's the kind of using that data to try and actually affect a behaviour change so that these data breaches were taken with it more seriously and they were handled much more empathetically. And the one thing that came through the research was that organisations were often dismissing it as, oh, it's just an admin error, a slip of an email, a mislaid piece of paper. And they weren't thinking about, again, the data in terms of people, in terms of the very life-changing impacts that these breaches could often have on people, especially if you are someone already in a vulnerable situation. So that combination, I think, of, using a real data-led approach, but also shifting how people think about data was what made, for me, the Ripple Effect really powerful. But it really did make it, the approach there was making sure that people really kind of came through all elements of what we did in terms of telling the stories and playing back the stories on the impacts that these breaches had on people, to how we actually went about gathering the information and developing the campaign. It really did have people at the heart of it.
Ultra-processed data, a sparkly brain, respect for a repeatable scientific process, convincing no one of an argument by showing them an Excel spreadsheet. Data, but with people at the heart of it. What a marvellous set of stories in Season 9, all rooted deeply in data, garlanded by glorious turns of phrase. I'd like to thank all of the guests from Season 9 of Data Malarkey: Kelly, Angela, Susan, Stephen, Kerry and Angus. Thanks for agreeing to appear on the podcast, and for all of the work that you, your colleagues and organisations have put in to share and promote our episodes with your communities. That also helps to extend our reach so much. Thanks also to our growing army of listeners, streamers and particularly our subscribers. There are thousands of you now, with particularly strong progress on YouTube. And together you all make the job of finding guests, interviewing them and promoting the episodes on social media so rewarding. Knowing so many of you are listening and sharing and interacting makes it all worthwhile. As ever, if you have any suggestions of guests, if you think you make a good guest yourself, or you know or work with someone who'd make a great guest and tell a great story about how they make smarter use of data, just drop us an email at hello@usingdatasmarter.com or complete the application form at https://www.usingdatasmarter.com/guest. We're now taking a break of a month or so, giving ourselves a chance to breathe, and you, our loyal listeners, a chance to catch up on some of the episodes in this and perhaps previous series that you may have missed. I look forward to welcoming you back here with more data-driven common sense soon, with the Data Malarkey podcast dropping every other Wednesday on Apple, Spotify and YouTube Music. And video episodes go live a week later on our YouTube channel at Data Malarkey. See you here again soon.